He didn't come with lawyers, he didn't come with bodyguards. He walked into that courtroom alone, no entourage, no shield, only the quiet strength of a man who had stared down coups, corporations, and colonizers. But today he was entering something colder, a courtroom dressed like theater. And at the center of it all sat a man in black robes, holding a gavel in one hand and arrogance in the other. Before President Ibrahim Traoré could say a single word in his own defense, the judge leaned forward, smirked, and said with a sneer, "This isn't Africa, Mr. President. You don't command anything here." Then louder, for the cameras, he added, "If you raise your voice again, I'll have you dragged out in chains, just like the rest of your people." The room went still, but Traoré didn't blink. He didn't respond with anger, he didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped forward, calm and deliberate, and placed a single red folder on the judge's bench. Then, with the composure of a man who knew exactly what he carried, he said, "Your robe may be clean, Your Honor, but your hands are not." The judge laughed at first, but when Traoré opened the folder, the laughter died in his throat. Traoré looked him in the eye and spoke just once more, "These are your chains. You just haven't felt them tighten yet." What happened next, in just 9 minutes, would leave a federal judge in handcuffs, ignite a media firestorm, and leave the entire world in awe. How did a single man, a quiet voice, and a red folder bring down a figure who believed he could never fall? And what exactly was inside that folder that made a powerful man tremble? And it all began on that morning. The courthouse didn't smell like justice, it smelled like disinfectant and show business. The marble steps were power-washed before dawn, scrubbed until they gleamed like the floor of a luxury hotel. A city crew was seen buffing the brass railings at 5:30 a.m., not because justice demanded polish, but because the networks demanded a clean shot. It felt more like the setup for a movie premiere than a federal hearing. News vans lined the block, camera crews rehearsed angles as if prepping for a documentary. But what they were really preparing for was a spectacle. A sea of signs filled the plaza, justice for victims, order in the court, and oddly, Africa on trial. Most of the protesters had no idea what they were protesting. One man held his sign upside down, another asked a journalist who Ibrahim Traoré was. No one cared, they were paid, parked, and positioned. Some were handed pre-made posters with one hand and turkey sandwiches with the other. Somewhere nearby, someone whispered, "This is what democracy looks like." But no one believed it. The mood was smug, not solemn. This wasn't about law, this was about optics. Inside, the surreal continued. Rows of bottled water lined the judge's bench, none for the defense. Velvet rope separated reporters by media tier. Even the jury seating, though symbolic in this hearing, had been wiped down, lit just right, and adorned with a discreet scent diffuser to mask the sterile weight of what was about to unfold. Behind glass, anchors whispered into microphones, testing their serious voice as they stared through the courtroom like red carpet correspondents watching for celebrities. No one was here to hear the truth, they were here to capture the moment when a foreign president, a man from a country they couldn't pronounce, would be brought low by the great American system. What they didn't know was that the real story wouldn't come from a camera, it would come from a folder. Judge Douglas Harlan was backstage, but not behind a curtain. No, his theater had no velvet drapes, his stage was lined with mahogany and lit by LED panels masked as chandeliers. A former television legal analyst, Harlan didn't just preside over cases, he starred in them. Every morning before a high-profile hearing, he stood in front of a full-length mirror in his private chamber and practiced facial expressions. Today, he smiled, adjusted his chin slightly to the left, checked the angles under harsh lighting, then nodded to himself like a man who had rehearsed victory. He wasn't here to uphold the law, he was here to go viral. His robe, custom-stitched, slightly oversized for dramatic effect, flowed behind him as he entered. A court assistant fluffed his cushion, not for comfort, but for posture. Two aides debated whether the gavel's brass handle was polished enough to reflect light properly on camera. His Instagram bio read, "Justice and drama, delivered." And he meant it. A year earlier, one of his courtroom clips, him slamming the gavel and declaring "order" with authority, had reached 6.2 million views. That moment had earned him an invitation to a late-night talk show. That mattered more to him than a ruling on international asylum. To Harlan, justice wasn't blind, it was branded. Today's target, a foreign leader. Not a criminal, not a murderer, not even an accused fraud. Just a man who had said too much in the wrong place with the wrong skin tone. Harlan had been briefed already. The man was principled, calm, and unwilling to be bought. But that didn't matter, because the cameras weren't here to see principle, they were here to see power humbled. And Harlan was determined to be the one holding the hammer. Before the defendant even entered the courtroom, the verdict had already been rehearsed. Not in legal chambers, in press rooms. A press liaison from the Western Daily had already distributed pre-written headlines to select media outlets. Trial raises denial falls flat, Judge Harlan restores order in courtroom clash, a masterclass in Western justice. One outlet, UBN, had even drafted a video thumbnail featuring a split screen, Harlan looking stern, looking emotional. They hadn't even seen his face yet. It didn't matter. The story had been written without the truth. The prosecution's evidence was a parade of ambiguity, photocopied receipts with no dates, testimony from masked witnesses with no verifiable backgrounds, documents stripped of context and watermarked, confidential, for theatrical flair. The courtroom's social media account, yes, the courtroom had one, scheduled a tweet for 12:45 p.m., justice speaks loudest in silence. Hashtag Judge Harlan delivers. It would be posted regardless of how the hearing went. The actual trial was a technicality, the show was the main event. But there was something more dangerous than any conspiracy, silence. Real silence. The kind that comes not from ignorance but from complicity. People knew. The court reporter had redacted Harlan's ad-libs before, the assistant had seen odd files arrive from corporate lobbyists, even the young clerk, Jonah Bell, had once caught a glimpse of a payment log he wasn't meant to see. But no one said anything. Everyone played their role. Justice was not being served, it was being packaged. Until a man arrived with no script, just a red folder. There was no announcement when he entered, no bailiff's voice calling out, no dramatic camera turn. Just a pause, a ripple through the room that no one could explain. Ibrahim Traoré walked in, not like a politician or a criminal, but like something else entirely, a presence. He wasn't in uniform, he wore no medals. His dark suit was plain, no flag pin, no statement. His face unreadable, but in his left hand, he held a red folder. Tightly, but not fearfully. More like a man carrying memory, or evidence, or both. The cameras scanned him for signs of fear, they found none. The audience looked for emotion, they saw only calm. The judge didn't rise, the bailiff didn't greet him, but Traoré didn't flinch. He walked slowly, directly to the defense table. No allies behind him, no lawyer beside him, no microphone in front of him. Just a chair, a desk, and that folder. When he sat, the microphones picked up the softest sound, the click of the folder landing on wood. It was quiet, but it echoed. The gallery didn't know why their neck hairs rose, the clerk, Jonah, stared at the folder like it was something dangerous. Because it didn't feel like a plea for innocence, it felt like a quiet promise of revelation. The audience had come expecting a collapse, but for the first time, they weren't sure who would fall. The judge broke the tension with a smirk. He leaned forward on his elbows and delivered his opening line like a punchline in a play. Mr. President, he said, drawing it out like a joke he'd told before, this isn't Africa. You don't command anything here. A few chuckles trickled from the gallery, not because it was funny, but because power had signaled permission to laugh. He continued, louder now, for the benefit of the cameras, if you raise your voice again, I'll have you dragged out in chains, just like the rest of your people. There it was, the line everyone was waiting for. A moment of humiliation dressed as courtroom order. And yet, Traoré didn't flinch. He didn't reply. He stood, calmly, with the weight of centuries behind him. He stepped toward the bench, he placed the red folder directly in front of the judge, looked him in the eye, and said, without raising his voice, your robe may be clean, but your hands are not. The gallery fell silent. The judge laughed, but the laughter was already starting to feel wrong. Then, slowly, carefully, Ibrahim Traoré opened the folder. And the world changed. The silence after Traoré's words wasn't just awkward, it was suffocating. Your robe may be clean, but your hands are not. The phrase didn't land like an insult, it landed like a verdict. For a second, the courtroom didn't know how to respond. The laughter that had once echoed in the gallery now shrank back into throats. The judge, still seated like a man accustomed to control, attempted a half-laugh, but it came out tight, almost choked. The cameras kept rolling, but even the news anchors behind the glass paused, unsure whether they were still covering a performance or the beginning of something else entirely. Harlan raised an eyebrow, leaned back in his chair, and tried to regain command with his usual smugness. That's quite a statement, Mr. Traoré, he said, eyes flickering toward the gallery to check if the room would rally behind him again. But they didn't. The audience wasn't reacting, they were watching. closely. Something had shifted, not just in the air, but in the order of things. And for the first time all morning, Judge Harlan felt something unfamiliar creeping in, unease. Traoré didn't say another word. He didn't need to. He slowly opened the red folder, revealing its contents not with theatrics, but with quiet certainty. No dramatic flair, no pause for effect. Just paper. Page after page being laid gently on the bench. But with every sheet he turned, the courtroom's pulse quickened. The first document was straightforward, a wire transfer receipt from a Cayman Territories bank, dated 3 months prior, sent from a shell company under Oromcore Incorporated. The recipient, an account registered to Thorne Family Holdings LLC. A name that meant little to the gallery, but meant everything to Judge Harlan, because it belonged to his son-in-law. The next page was a notarized agreement, quietly stamped by a legal firm in Zurich, outlining a $2.5 million consultation fee exchanged in return for favorable outcomes in regulatory proceedings. Another name appeared, a mining site in Mali, previously blocked by environmental law, overturned by a ruling Harlan had signed himself. The folder continued. Internal emails, leaked by someone inside Oromcore, referred to Harlan not by his title, but by code, the gatekeeper. One line read, "Gatekeeper confirms pushback plan. He'll kill it in court if we get heat." The documents were brutal in their clarity. There were no vague accusations, no conspiracy theory diagrams. Only numbers, dates, bank codes, contracts, and signatures. Some from Oromcore executives, some from Harlan's own daughter. At first, the judge didn't react. His jaw tightened, his fingers curled slightly on the bench. But by page 4, his skin had gone pale. He shifted in his seat, not dramatically, just enough for those watching to know he had seen something he recognized. Something that confirmed the folder wasn't theater, it was a threat to his throne. Across the room, a journalist dropped her pen. Another forgot to blink. One even whispered, "Is this real?" The answer was yes. And the only man who wasn't surprised was Traoré. Judge Harlan cleared his throat and reached for a lifeline. "This court," he said sharply, trying to summon his earlier authority, "does not entertain foreign propaganda." His voice cracked slightly on the last word. He turned to the young court clerk, Jonah Bell, and ordered, "Verify these immediately. We will not allow this courtroom to become a stage for disinformation." But Jonah didn't move. He stood, paralyzed, not by fear of truth, but by something deeper, recognition. He had seen one of those documents before, weeks ago, in the court's restricted archive. He wasn't supposed to open the file, but he had. And now it sat in front of him again, not hidden, but exposed. The judge repeated himself, "Now, Mr. Bell." But the clerk only took a step back. Small, hesitant, but defiant. The kind of step that didn't make noise, but made history. For a moment, Harlan stared at him, unsure whether to scream, threaten, or pretend nothing was wrong. But it was too late. The performance had slipped, the story had flipped, and the people in the room weren't watching a show anymore. They were witnessing a collapse. Jonah looked at Traoré. The president met his eyes. No words, no nod, just that same unshaken calm. And something unspoken passed between them, the quiet agreement of two men who had chosen to tell the truth, even when it cost them everything. Just as Harlan began to shuffle the papers desperately, trying to regain footing, the bailiff approached the bench. Slowly, quietly, not with a shout but with a whisper that carried the weight of a sledgehammer. "Your Honor," he said, not meeting the judge's eyes, "you are requested for questioning." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. At first, Harlan didn't understand. "Excuse me," he asked, his voice cracking again. But the bailiff didn't blink. The Inspector General's office confirmed. "There's now a formal inquiry. You are to step down, effective immediately." The courtroom gasped, but no one spoke. No one moved. Harlan's face drained of color. His hands hovered above the documents like they might vanish if he didn't touch them. He looked out to the gallery, his audience, his stage, but all he saw were eyes staring, waiting, not for a ruling, but for justice. Traoré remained seated. He didn't smile, he didn't blink. The red folder, now empty, lay flat in front of him, a symbol of quiet resistance, of truth not shouted but delivered. The judge tried to speak again, but his voice was gone. The cameras had captured it all. Not the verdict, but the reversal. Not the trial, but the reckoning. And for the first time in his career, Douglas Harlan realized the courtroom was no longer his. In the hours that followed Judge Harlan's quiet removal, chaos rippled through the institutions that had prepared for something very different. At Western Daily, an editor stared blankly at the pre-scheduled article titled, "Traoré Humiliated in U.S. Courtroom Showdown." It had been set to publish at 1 p.m. The story was still queued, ready to go, with quotes, reactions, even a fabricated breakdown of Traoré's so-called meltdown. But now, with the judge in handcuffs and the folder trending worldwide, the piece read like satire. One assistant editor, panicking, asked, "Can we reframe this as satire?" Another muttered, "Do we just delete the entire thing?" Elsewhere, at UBN, anchors had just finished recording their midday segment when the news broke that the judge, not Traoré, had been removed. The editor in the control booth dropped her headset and swore. One producer suggested they blur Traoré's face in the footage until we know if he's a hero or a villain. It was too late. The internet had already decided. Within 90 minutes, UBN quietly pulled its original headlines and replaced them with "emerging details in courtroom corruption case." But screenshots of the original were already circulating, labeled "numbered deleted truths." Several political blogs that had mocked Traoré's demeanor earlier in the day began deleting posts in real time. Influencers who'd called him just another strongman in a suit suddenly tweeted about his stoic presence and unshakable dignity. At one point, a satire page joked, "Breaking, Western media forgets how to pronounce his name, now calls him Your Excellency instead." The irony stung because it was true. Even the neutral international broadcasters scrambled to explain why they had framed the event so differently just hours before. The narrative had collapsed, and for once, it hadn't been rewritten by power, but by silence. By sundown, the red folder had become a symbol, not of evidence, but of reckoning. Clips of the moment Traoré placed it on the bench spread across the globe in seconds. One video, captioned, "He didn't say much. He didn't have to," racked up 5 million views in under 4 hours. Another edit, shared by a digital artist in Lagos, turned the scene into a short animated film titled, "The Folder That Spoke." On Twitter, a journalist posted, "He said less than 100 words. Humbled an empire. Changed everything." The comment was retweeted over 80,000 times. People began counting exactly how many words he had spoken in the courtroom that day. The final tally, 94. That was all it took. 94 words to bring down a judge, expose an international bribery chain, and flip a continent's media narrative. What made it go viral wasn't just the scandal, it was the restraint. In an age where everyone shouts louder to be heard, Traoré had done the opposite. No slogans, no speeches, no anger. Just facts, delivered with the calm precision of someone who had nothing left to prove. A university professor in South Africa tweeted, "We teach our students to build arguments. Traoré teaches us how to become one." On TikTok, a 62-year-old former journalist, the platform's newest unlikely star, posted a reaction video in tears. "I covered Watergate," he said, "but I've never seen something unravel this fast, or this quietly." It was the silence that spread. The kind that didn't whisper, but thundered. And somehow, in a media world trained to chase noise, the world had stopped to listen. In the 3 days that followed, Ibrahim Traoré said nothing. Not a single statement. He declined interviews, ignored phone calls, refused all press briefings. The presidential office in Burkina Faso released no formal comments. Western journalists camped outside embassies, talk show producers offered blank check appearance fees, but Traoré never showed. There were no thank you speeches, no press conferences, no mic drop moment. Just silence. And somehow, that silence said more than any quote could. For once, it wasn't about spinning the truth, it was about letting it stand. What he did instead was more powerful. He released one handwritten note, 112 words long, given to a small independent Burkinabe journalist and posted without fanfare. It read, in part, "Power doesn't need to scream when the truth is real. It doesn't need permission to echo." That one line became a mural in downtown Dakar. It became a tattoo on a protester's arm in Johannesburg. It became the caption under Instagram posts from journalists who had doubted him only days earlier. What emerged wasn't just a shift in opinion, it was a shift in power. Not political power, moral power. The kind that cannot be manufactured, the kind that can't be bought, borrowed, or broadcast. It has to be earned and held with stillness. Traoré hadn't come to conquer the court, he came to expose it. He didn't raise his voice, he raised a mirror. And when the people looked into it, many saw something they hadn't seen in years, the difference between being heard and being believed. He reminded the world that sometimes the loudest revolution is the one spoken without sound. In the days that followed the hearing, investigators and journalists alike began combing through every document from the red folder. The same folder that had once sat silently on the defense table, unassuming, almost out of place. But now it had become the most explosive item in the Western legal world. Inside were over 40 pages, carefully indexed, each more damning than the last. The irony hit hard. The man who lectured foreign leaders on ethics had contracts signed with the very companies he once claimed to be protecting the public from. In internal memos between Oromcore executives, Judge Douglas Harland wasn't referred to as Your Honor or Judge. He was codenamed the Gatekeeper. One email, dated 6 weeks before the trial, read, "Gatekeeper has cleared the path. Mali acquisition will proceed as planned. Noise will be handled." There was no need to speculate. The language was surgical. Payment logs showed monthly disbursements routed through 2 dummy holding companies in the Cayman Territories. One under his daughter's name, the other under the trust fund of a newborn grandchild. The corruption wasn't an accident, it was designed. The judge wasn't compromised, he was built for compromise. One contract contained a non-disclosure clause that included his full signature in clean cursive. He had signed it willingly. The same man who scolded Ibrahim Traoré for standing up to foreign influence had cashed 6-figure checks from companies that didn't just exploit Africa, they carved it open. The next section of the folder shifted the courtroom's horror from personal greed to environmental devastation. Traoré had included a series of satellite images from regions in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Lands once protected under sovereign law, now stripped bare. The contrast was horrifying. Side-by-side photos showed rivers that had once run clear and clean, now murky brown, choked with sediment and industrial runoff. Forests that had once shielded local villages from heat and drought had been flattened. Huge mining pits, hundreds of feet deep, had replaced sacred ground. In one particularly jarring image, a village school sat less than a mile from a toxic waste dump. The children there had rashes, the elders coughed blood. Another document attached was a confidential health report from a regional hospital, a spike in respiratory infections, skin lesions, and miscarriages, all within the area surrounding Oromcore's operations. These were not isolated events, they were patterns. They were consequences. And every single one had been signed off on by Judge Harland's rulings. Each decision had stripped another layer of legal protection. Each rubber stamp of his gavel had enabled companies to bypass environmental law in exchange for development deals. The same judge who accused Traoré of leading a lawless country had, in fact, legalized the destruction of entire ecosystems. And now the evidence was public, not just because it was printed on paper, but because it was written on the faces of people who would never sit in that courtroom. The horror wasn't just political, it was human. By the time the folder reached its final section, no one in the courtroom had any illusion left. This wasn't just about one judge, this was about a system that had learned to smile while it sold its soul. At the heart of the documents lay a chilling truth. Harland wasn't being bribed in secret, he was participating in an economy. One that traded silence for access and sovereignty for quarterly profits. One memo from a London-based firm summarized the exchange with brutal efficiency. For jurisdictional leverage in Western courts, Harland remains our preferred asset. The word asset sent a collective chill through everyone who read it. He wasn't viewed as a person, he was a tool. An instrument. A guarantee. The folder revealed that Oromcore had coordinated 11 legal dismissals over the span of 3 years, all through Harland's court. Cases ranging from illegal displacement to water theft, all shut down before they reached trial. Victims were silenced with paperwork, protesters were labeled security threats, witnesses were discredited through media outreach strategies. One internal memo even laid out a playbook: disinformation, delay, denial. And Harland had signed it all into motion. This wasn't justice, this was betrayal in a robe. Foreign corporations hadn't just bought minerals, they had bought rulings. They had bought narratives. They had bought the illusion that law still existed. In truth, they didn't need to conquer countries anymore. All they needed was a judge with a clean robe and dirty hands. Near the end of the hearing, when the air in the courtroom was so heavy it felt like grief, Traoré stood, not to defend himself, but to deliver one final truth. He lifted a single page from the folder. The courtroom watched as he held it up for the judge to see, but spoke to the room. "This," he said, his voice low, clear, and unshaken, "is what the world calls justice. And it bears your name." He didn't shout, he didn't accuse. He just read the evidence aloud. The page he held was a land deed, an official government document showing the transfer of protected forest to a private mining firm. Signed and stamped by Judge Douglas Harland himself. In the corner was a note, fast-tracked under confidential order. Strategic international value. It was a legal document, a sentence. Not the kind a judge gives, but the kind a nation receives when it's sold off, piece by piece. The gallery sat frozen. Even the court reporter stopped typing. The cameras clicked once, then fell silent. That one page, with that one name, said it all. It was the moment the room realized this hadn't been a trial, it had been a mirror. And they weren't watching a defendant collapse, they were watching an empire crack. It happened 2 years before the courtroom, long before the cameras, before the red folder, before the silence that cracked open a system. It took place in a sleek hotel room in Nairobi, neutral ground, as the emissaries called it. The men who entered were not thugs. They didn't wear uniforms, they didn't issue threats. They wore tailored suits and cologne that cost more than some village's annual budget. 3 of them, all white, all grinning, all fluent in charm. They introduced themselves casually, like they weren't representing the most powerful mining consortium in the world. "We're admirers," one said. "The world needs more leaders like you," said another, placing a hand on Traoré's shoulder as if they'd known each other for years. But the fourth voice in the room didn't come from a mouth, it came from a silver briefcase, placed gently on the table. Inside, contracts, wire instructions, foreign accounts, and one line handwritten in French, "For your nation's stability and your family's comfort." The number, $50 million. Tax-free. Untraceable. They didn't say it out loud, but the message was crystal clear. This wasn't a bribe in the old-fashioned sense, it was a purchase. Not of his government, not even of his policies. They were offering to buy his silence. The men didn't want him gone, they wanted him still. They didn't want a war, they wanted a quiet leader who would stop making noise about land, about sovereignty, about African resources being stolen beneath the guise of investment. They didn't want him to disappear, they just wanted him to sit down. To smile. To shake hands at summits. To sign papers. And to shut up. The pitch was smooth, polished, rehearsed. "The world will celebrate you," one said. "You'll be called visionary," another added, sliding the contract forward like it was a diploma. "No one needs to know. You don't even have to change your stance publicly. Just let the courts handle the land cases. Let the legal process do its work. In other words, stop interfering. Let the deals go through. Let the people be displaced quietly, legally, invisibly." Their language was so elegant, it almost disguised the rot inside it. Almost. What they offered wasn't money, it was silence. A silence disguised as diplomacy. A smile purchased with sickness. A quiet death for his country disguised as peace. And as Traoré listened, his face never changed. He didn't raise his voice, he didn't accuse, he didn't storm out. He just listened. And when they were done, he stood up slowly, closed the briefcase without touching the documents, and said one line that none of them understood, "Not then, and maybe not even now, I was not raised to sell what I did not build." They tried to laugh it off. One of them said, "You'll think about it." Another smirked, "Everyone does." But Traoré didn't respond. He simply left the room. No deal, no handshake, no promise. Just a refusal wrapped in dignity. And they weren't used to that. They were used to power that yielded, that nodded, that collapsed under the weight of wealth. But this time, wealth had no weight, because the man they tried to buy had already been paid in something much stronger. Months later, far from the polished hotel suites, Traoré sat beneath the wide shade of a mango tree in a dusty village outside Ouagadougou. No cameras, no air conditioning. Just a circle of teachers, elders, and farmers with soil still under their fingernails. They didn't ask for development plans, they didn't want speeches. They wanted something else, something more dangerous than demands, they wanted a promise. Traoré gave it to them. He told them about the meeting, about the briefcase, about the smile that cost $50 million. And then he said, "They offered to let me stay in power if I let them steal the land you live on. I said no. And I'll say no again if they come back." One of the elders, nearly blind, voice like gravel, reached out, took Traoré's hand, and said, "Then you will walk alone, son. But walk anyway." That moment stayed with him more than the meeting, more than the money, more than the courtroom. It was there, under that tree, that the weight of leadership was not given, it was chosen. Not by election, not by headlines, but by memory. The kind of memory that says, "You are not the first to walk this land, so don't be the last to protect it." And Traoré carried that promise like armor. After the refusal, the plan changed. Subtle at first. Interviews disappeared. Western legal firms declined his requests. International partners delayed meetings. Court cases tied to resource disputes were suddenly redirected or suspended. Behind closed doors, he was labeled unpredictable, a populist, a threat to global stability. The same voices that once called him Africa's reformer now called him volatile. Western think tanks published papers speculating on mental decline. Editorials framed him as out of control. Alone. But that was the point. They wanted him alone. By the time his hearing in the US was announced, no firm would represent him. Even within his own region, allies fell silent, fearing retaliation. His advisors begged him not to go. Let the ambassador handle it, they said. Send a lawyer. Send a delegate. But he refused. Because this time, it wasn't just about law, it was about memory. It was about the mango tree. About the promise. So he flew alone, walked into that courtroom with no counsel, no allies. Just a red folder and the words of an old man who told him to walk anyway. He carried truth like a soldier carries a weapon, not to strike, but to protect. Not to perform, but to endure. And when they saw he couldn't be bought, they tried to break him. But they had made one mistake, they thought silence was weakness. They forgot sometimes silence is the sound of steel. In the awkward lull that followed the revelations from the red folder, Judge Harlan did what most men in power do when their mask begins to crack. He pretended nothing had happened. With his face rigid and voice unusually nasal, he cleared his throat, shuffled his papers, and began reading from a pre-prepared statement heavy with legal jargon and cold detachment. As this court resumes proceedings, he muttered, we remind all parties that foreign materials introduced into the record must first. He stopped for a second. The room was too still. No one was listening. The cameras weren't pointing at him anymore. Even the stenographer had momentarily paused her typing, uncertain whether to continue recording words that suddenly felt irrelevant. Harlan tried again, this time louder, almost theatrically. I repeat, under Section 38, foreign exhibits. But it was no use. Somewhere in the gallery, a reporter whispered, just loud enough to be heard by the nearest mic, did he just say, foreign? Another chuckled under his breath. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The man who welcomed foreign money into his family's offshore accounts was now trying to discredit the evidence for being foreign. A few camera lenses quietly zoomed out. They weren't capturing a judge anymore, they were capturing a man unraveling in real time. The interruption was almost comically gentle. Mid-sentence, as Harlan fumbled with legal citations, a figure moved behind him. Not fast, not aggressive, just inevitable. It was the bailiff, the same one who had stood motionless for the entire hearing. This time, he stepped forward and placed a single hand on the judge's shoulder. Not firm, not forceful, just final. You're being removed, sir, he said softly. That was it. No gavel slam, no shouting. Just quiet humiliation. Harlan blinked as if he hadn't heard correctly. He turned his head slightly, mouth